have two new bpNichol books coming out at one time is a phenomenal moment, and I'm thrilled to be able to just participate in this conversation, which will be featuring Stephen, Lola, and Brian. What we're going to be looking at is the two books, and I hope everybody's gone out and already bought theirs, because we will be referring to it, and we'll refer to it by page number, so you can follow along carefully. Why I'm drawn to Nichol is I do feel that he is, out of all the authors that have come out of Canada, he offers the most concerted and emotionally honest engagement with the language crisis, a problem that I take quite personally. And he's interested in particularly language's inability to equal the things it describes, and thus its inability to bridge the distance between self and other. In reading through this book of his early works, we see him grappling with this and turning to the ideas of the language crisis and his problem with it, but doing so through lyric modes, through concrete modes, and various other points of engagement. I wanted to start off the night in his absence with his presence by reading a quick little section so that his voice is on stage. I hope that's okay with everybody. We've cleared it with the panelists, so I'm not going to get any shots from behind. I have a printed out version because it's a little bit bigger font than in the book. It's on page 90, though. It's from Journeying in the Returns. It's this beautiful little section. It's a three-line stanzas, tercets to explore three specific images that he's looking at. What I love about his exploration of the relations is how he uses the stanza breaks to highlight their difference as he's exploring their similarities. So these lovely, lovely pauses between them. So to get things started. The sun, the breast, the eye, that which gives, that which takes, that which yields, is given to and gives, that which surrounds, that which enfolds, that which opens, is opened to in opening, that which is spoken of and speaks its names upon our breath in various guises. So, turning to bpNichol Beginnings, a collection of 10 early major poetic sequences. Stephen, I'd like to turn to you and ask you why this collection of early publications, and perhaps why now? Right. And get things going.
Well, I guess I would start by saying that for people who know me, they know that I'm rather a selfish person, and so I was tired of having to go to the archives or to dig around and try and find these fugitive texts that are hard to find in all these places, and I thought they would go well together. So, for example, the very first sequence, the cycles, I had never actually seen, and there was hardly any copies in Canada. So a lot of this was an excuse to bring this material that I really wanted to see myself and then share with the other people who are fans of Nichol. Why now? I think this is a great time in terms of Nichol's material being reissued. We had last year the 3-volume, The Love and Zygle collection come out. A few years ago we had the Captain Poetry, and so these seem to be the texts that we're still missing from the Nichol corpus, and that we wanted people to see. So those are the two.
It's lovely to have the facsimile of cycles as well, the 1965 one that D.A. Levy published. Maybe we could actually talk about D.A. Levy a little bit, because he plays a recurring role in this collection. He was published the very first book by Nichol, and then comes back later on in the Lament long text, which becomes a concrete poem. It's kind of a harrowing dirge against the grim political realities that led D.A. Levy to his death, a suicide in '68. How do you see his relationship with D.A. Levy?
There's a lot of friendship and a lot of friends in the text and collaborators, and it sort of exposes Nichol's communitarian sort of spirit. And I sort of thought that Levy is certainly one of the main collaborators, one of the main friendships that appear in the text. And so he was from Cleveland, must spend almost all his life in Cleveland, and published Seven Flowers Press and Renegade Press and Marijuana Quarterly, and they were these very dirty Mimeo kind of things. And I think Nichol contacted him through mail. They mostly corresponded through mail. And Levy did do his first chapbook, that's Cycles, which begins the sequence. And we reproduced it as actually, as a facsimile, so you can actually see the Mimeo that it originally appeared as. And in some ways, I suggest that this is almost like a collaboration between Nichol and Levy, because Levy would have been retyping the poems that Nichol sent on the Mimeo sheets, and so you
They
get a
were
bit
also
of...
both involved in Dirty Mimeo.
Yes,
That was
yes.
the first connection, I would think. I think one of the valuable things about your book, Stephen, is that it's a refresher course, it was for me, in terms of some of the early themes that Nichol was working out and expands on in the Martyrology and later work. I found that one of the most fascinating parts of your book in terms of, again, a refresher, but the theme, the red muddy water, the page, the window, all the, unbelievable beginnings of this. I was also struck by, as you say, not juvenilia, but how beautifully young these were. Very beginnings of things, right? Yeah, more and more to say about that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, certainly you can see martyrology in a lot of this stuff. That's one of the surprising things I thought when I started putting the book together, how early he's starting to work through these ideas.
He's beginning to work through these particular pieces and particular themes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I was also struck, too, by there could have been a slide, although Lola and I talked a bit about this, a slide towards sentimentality, the sludge of sentimentality in some of this, and how, with the use of the concrete work, which is amply explained in your book, and the hard concrete and the lyric gesture in some sense, and how the formulations that brought up to the Martyrology were essentially a way of getting out of that kind of sentimentality, The themes that he talks about, the gaze, the eyes, the love, the pain, all of that could have been really slid right off into somewhere else, which was incredibly inventive to be able to actually express those feelings without, that slide, as it were.
Mm-hmm.
He's still quite divided in this text, in these early ones, though. I mean, these different bpNichols, you could almost talk about. The sides of bpNichol have a boundary to them. The concrete texts are quite discrete concrete. The visual comic one is very clean in its own way, and then the lyric voice has a very strong coherence to them. As he's a few years before just really investing in border blur at this point.
Absolutely, yeah, that's right. But also, if you look at the concrete work of that time, Nichol was doing. He built on that, of course, but he was actually playing in a slightly different way than a lot of concrete. He was actually working with especially in this book here, which people can see quite readily, working with just letters, actual letters, and their play and interplay, almost as artwork, and not so much poem in a certain way, right? Again, a really informative. The two things are so part and parcel of Nichol's work. I see the distinction, and I see this phase, and I can see that phase, but I really do see them as hard edge and gesture, in a sense,
Well, Lola, in a recent essay, you talked about the many metaphoric personas of bpNichol that he used in telling his stories. That might be a productive way to think about the division between these sides of him as actually almost moves and maneuvers that he uses in a text.
He was very interested in different forms because he said one form was too restrictive. So to stay within one form, whether it was cartoons or the lyric or a singing, song, or concrete, he found that this was too restrictive. Therefore, the only way he could say it all or as much as he could was to explore different forms, and that's why he kept switching over and over. I think he did the same as far as the metaphorical personas. The bpNichol of the comic books is not the same bpNichol as the Book of Hours, which gets to be quite lyrical. But he explored all of these forms in sometimes using the I pronoun, but it was always a disassociated I. He would write I is, not I am, because it was always the I as a he, as a she, as a they, as a we. It was an all-encompassing I. So the same way that he explored the different personas of Captain Poetry, of the Martyrology, even of friendships, they were always disassociated in order for the form, that I, to inform his content. The form always informed the content, not the other way around.
On page 216, there's a lovely line that says, part of the terror was finding the edges weren't there, which is an interesting comment from a young author's perspective who would grow into the kind of embrace of that edgelessness, the border blur. Because here it's still something terrifying and jolting as an experience.
I just watched a old movie that Michael Ondaatje did of Barry, when Barry was in his early 20s. And one of the scenes as the movie opens is a gutted out window. And Barry walks through the empty window. And that stands for all the frames that he did, writing within the frame, doing that tension that he had within the frame, within the page, with the outside world. It was always there.
In the to follow along with that, when we had the Pataphysical Fairs, and Barry did the Pataphysical Hardware Company, he was selling a critical frame of reference, which is a rectangle of clear plastic, which sort of tells you where that's at in terms of that. There was no border with it, right? And
He comes out of the frame.
Yeah,
by the way.
exactly. And
He walks out at the end.
And also you can put it anywhere you want, here, there.
If he had come from the 80s as opposed to the 70s, maybe he would have cut himself on the glass on purpose.
Well, the Martyrology.
Yeah.
Stephen, you've done a lot of work on bpNichol over the years, but this project changes things. It sets these pieces up side by side and provides a new context, and a new context alters everything as we know. Did you have any surprises in going through this? New Nichols.
New Nichols. Well, I mean, as Brian and Lola were saying, it's always interesting to see that he's working in so many modes that you sort of thought it was concrete or lyric, but even within the lyric, they're quite different types of lyrics. There's some that are haiku, there's some are very minimalist. I was surprised to see what I saw more of an American New Poetic influence in this kind of stuff on the West Coast. More of a Creeley, more not so much Olson, but a sort of a Creeley minimalism, even Duncan and some of its kind of stuff. Whereas if you read the early interviews with Nichol, he always is foregrounding his nationalist sort of affinities that he was with Bissett and he was with the West Coast writers and Copperthorne and this kind of stuff. So I saw more of an American influence, which maybe gets tapered off a bit later on in his writing. Also, really interested in Asian poetics, like the haiku and the tanka and all that kind of stuff, which then reemerges in the Martyrology with his interest in the Utanuki. So I think those are the two things. That there was a little more wider. He was reading wider, and his being influenced by a wider sort of body of material.
Vancouver is quite prominent in this book, actually. Appears a number, especially Journey and the Returns. You talk about that in the introduction.
Especially the early stuff, yeah. That's right.
And of course, he comes from Vancouver to Toronto, and these publications are all after that move. So some of the anxiety of arriving in a new place may be behind some of these works. But it is interesting that out of the Vancouver authors, and I'm thinking of the 63 conference, the famous one, the only one that is overlooked and lost in all the discussions and scholarship is, of course, the Canadian Margaret Avison, who is the one that Nichol was most attached to. So even in his New American approach, the side that he latches onto the most there, publicly anyways, is a Canadian author inside of that.
He looked at all writers as a genealogy, all the myths of the Bible, the Testaments, the American authors that you talk about. It was all part of his genealogy, that not his history. He always said, quoted Stein in, what does history teach? History teaches. His was not a history. He was playing with a whole line of different writers, different texts, different mythologies. He was always playing with that. He saw writing as a play, not. He wanted to be playful in everything he did. So he did, the puns. He was very good at puns. He did the songs. He would sing in the subway and embarrass us all. It was playful, and he never wrote against all those texts. A lot of people thought he was writing against the Testaments and the Martyrology, or he was writing against certain writers. He didn't. He played around with it in order to create his own metaphorical personas.
Yeah, I found it interesting in going over the work in Stephen's book, how, I won't say how little play there was, because there is play, but not as much as in Martyrology. And when I thought about that, I thought about the maturity of being able to really sing and play in the Martyrology, really allowing himself to do exactly what you said, just to take takes on things, right? To play. Again, refreshing, because it gives you a place to stand again and look at the work, right?
The pun is such an interesting part of his writing, and there's a dialogue I think I've tracked between him and Bissett during this period when, in 1970, bpNichol asked Bissett to write a book of theory, and one of the lines in Bissett's book is it's called "What Fucking Theory," right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is great.
Yeah.
But he has this beautiful line where he says, the pun fucks back.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a warning. Like you can, BP talks about puns as a portal to another truth.
Yeah,
Careful.
we
Be
call
careful.
we call them 2/3 puns, PU. Because some of them were real groaners, right? And of course, which he loved. He loved the idea that it was a groaner, right? I mean, he really did.
Oh, he loved to make people groan at parties. Yeah.
I mean, the other book, Theseus, has a lot more play in it, if you're talking about this sort of playfulness with language.
Yes. Yeah.
But it's also a bit of a warning, too. It's the labyrinth, it's the Minotaur, it's all these kind of things. So it has that, both that two-edged aspect that you're talking about of language.
Absolutely.
And so I know you got...
And also the pages as the labyrinth as well, because there's a lot about pages in here and the terror that pay on and on, very much so. I see it as a dynamic duo playing with the inseparable trio, in a sense, right? And what they did with it and what they could play with it. It's a nice piece. It's a very nice piece. I hadn't read it before until Jay sent it to me to blurb it. I was quite surprised and quite happy with that piece. And I don't know much about Clifford's work as well.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes an interesting extension of Nichols' writing. We've already talked about the idea of collaboration in a kind of metaphoric sense. This is, of course, a literal collaboration where his voice goes beyond himself, and it's not just BP's voice, and it's not just BP's groaners. It is other people's groaners too. And there's even when you think that's a bpNichol line, it resists that. There's just a slight twist that gives you another voice and another edge. But I love this fact that bpNichol, his influence in a way carries on in this extrapolation from this collaboration. I mean, this is finished posthumously, so we have this extension of his career in a way. It's still there in the text and palpable in many ways.
The collaborations, I think, stem from the fact that he was so aware how poetry began. Poetry began in song for the village, and he wanted to extend that. He did that within Therafields, and
Absolutely.
he did that with collaborating with other people. It was part of being a part of that village, of the poetic community. That was very important to him. And he was such a generous person that, you know, he would collaborate with anyone. He did a collaboration with me for a book of poetry to speak to, and I was so excited until it came out, and it was so obvious, the lines that were his and the lines that were mine. I thought, oh God, what have I done? And we did a collaboration, the three of us.
Yeah, I'll talk about that. The collaboration I did with Barry was started because we were both raised in BC, born in BC, was to write a memoir, our first memories, and do a call and response kind of back and forth and see if we could blend it into one memory. But the reason that collaboration was begun was I was in a very anguished, dry period and feeling really like shit. And Barry picked up on it and said, "Oh, why don't we do this? Why don't we do this thing about BC, right?" And so, Lola's right. The generosity is huge, and out of that, I mean, I've always loved revision, but Nichols' revision was absolutely unbelievable, and that was in the days of typewriters. There's no cut and paste, right? So if you made a mistake, it was, you know, do it again. We had done one whole page of the first part, and he rips it out of the typewriter and begins immediately to start crossing things out. And I said, can't we just wait for a minute and look at it? Can't we just stop for a second? No. But out of that, and this is never got published, but Barry thought that perhaps out of this memory of BC, that maybe memories of our first sexual experience would be kind of fun to do. So he invited Lola himself and the gay guy to sit down and do a little first sexual experience moment. So we
never published it.
We never published it, no. But the best thing, and this is a two-part story, so I will begin it and Lola will finish it. After I had written a particular line and I lit up a cigarette, and Barry leaned across the table and said, "Oh, do you always smoke after a hot line?" Lots of laughter. However, when it came to turn to Barry's hot line, this happened.
He said, "Oh, it's time for a sugar event." He was always having sugar events. And he got up and went to the corner donut store and got a dozen donuts.
After his hotline.
Instead of smoking. Yeah. I still have that piece tucked away.
I still have the piece in my files too. Every now and then I look at it, so maybe someday, who knows. But we didn't deem it successful.
Yeah, maybe not successful during that moment,
That
but
moment,
this may come back.
It may come back.
There was too much of an I as I in there. There's no way.
Yeah, right.
It's an I am as opposed to I is. That's the problem.
A part of Nichols' play, and I think Lola's quite right about the collaboration where Barry can go out and not only just in help and all the rest of that, but there would be an influence from whoever he was collaborating with. There would be this back and forth and back and forth, and Nichol loved a back and forth. I mean, he was incredibly fluent in speaking about what he did and how he did it, and you could get right into it with Nichol. You could say, well, you know, I don't understand this, and I don't understand why you've used this, and what about such and such? And there would be an absolute response. He'd sit down with you, and you would go through a poem or through whatever you were having trouble with, and we would actually deal with it. That's a remarkable part of Nichol. I don't hear that much today in terms of people really questioning each other about what are we doing and how are we doing it. And that's a real gift from Nichol, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, with this, I really sense that sense of generosity because the way I understand it from reading Wayne Clifford's intro and looking at the poem is it's three. The first part was written, and then 10 years later they came back to it again, and then 20 years later Wayne came back and finished it. And so it's got you can see the time and the process. Nichols always about process.
Absolutely.
But then Nichols insisting that he keep finishing it, and this generosity of to come back to it. Let's finish it. Let's finish it. And I also thinking about this text, I was surprised to see in Nichols' only selected book that he did when he was live, the one he did from Talon Books as elected. Right. There's a couple of pages from Theseus in that collection.
Oh, is there?
Yeah,
Oh.
and it's so. Nichol had such a vast amount of work, and he's doing his own selected, and he still chooses to put collaboration as part of that
Collaboration,
thing
yeah.
instead of any of the multitude of other texts he could
Yeah.
have. So he saw this as an important text,
An important text.
and he
yeah.
saw friendship and these kind of things as important to his collaboration. and
Friendship
over.
is all through it.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Do we have time for an anecdote? A really good martyrology anecdote. We'd gone to a reading one night, and Barry was reading, and we all assembled up at some pizza joint up on DuPont Street. Pierre Coupé was there that night, and as the evening wore on, Pierre Coupé became more and more obstreperous, talking and arguing and carrying on like this. And finally, Nichols said, "What the fuck are you so arguing about? What's going on here?" And Coupé says, "Well, I was hoping if I argued enough, I might get my name in the martyrology." So, yeah, friendship, yeah, major part of his work, actually.
Only if you write book 10, maybe the.
Right.
Well, I think that's a good note to wrap things up on. Of course, the conversation isn't done. It starts again when you pick up the book and carry on the conversation in all of its various manifestations and forms. Thank you to the panel. Please join me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to BookThug also.
This is a really great thing to have done.
Yeah, thank
Totally,
you, Jay
totally.
and Hazel.
Yeah. New readers.